Hi there! Today we're going to be going over how to create introductions for academic writing. So this is intended to be general advice that can be broadly applied to lots of different types of papers. Some things about the content and structure of your introduction will change based on the specific assignment that you're working on, the guidelines that you've been given, and the topic that you're working with, but there are still some things that generally you want an introduction to be doing for most types of writing. So the main things that you typically want to see in introductions will include three parts. The first part of this is something to draw in your readers. This is often called the hook. Maybe a sentence or two just sort of pique their interest to get them ready to learn more about what it is you're going to be talking about in your paper. The second thing that you want an introduction to include is enough background or context for your topic so that your reader can then go on to understand the main idea, whatever it is that you want to say about that specific topic. And usually at the very end of the introduction, the last sentence or couple of sentences will be where you express that main idea that is going to guide and be the foundation for the rest of the paper. Typically, this will be in the form of a thesis statement. Sometimes instead it might be a series of sentences that break down what each part of the essay is going to be talking about, but generally this is where you state for the first time that main idea for the rest of the paper. So some of the common questions that I get about how to craft an introduction starts with the hook itself. What are some ways that we can draw in our readers? I would say for most academic assignments, don't worry too much about this, especially when you're starting to write your paper. It can be very difficult to come up with something that's very interesting or unique that will sort of grab your reader's attention. I would say if you can start your introduction by just directly getting into the subject matter, the background, and the context, a lot of the time that's going to be a pretty solid way to start your essay as well. But if you can think of a more interesting way to start it off, get your reader thinking about the main themes or ideas that you're going to be discussing, that is always a plus. So some ways that you can draw in your reader include interesting or unexpected examples or stories related to your topic. Sometimes even if you phrase something about what you're going to say in a unique way, maybe in a way that readers wouldn't have thought about it before, that can be a good way to sort of gain their interest. Another thing you can use is powerful information or quotes, maybe something you were very surprised to learn about, some information that maybe your readers wouldn't know that you think might be new information to them that might surprise them. Some instructors may not want you to use direct quotes that will require citations in your introduction, so this is always something I would recommend checking with your guidelines or with your instructors to see if you can be including quotations in there. But if it's allowed, this can be a really interesting way to start off your paper. Something else you can do is pose a question or set up a scenario to kind of put your reader in the mindset of where you want them to be sort of analyzing or thinking about the ideas that you're going to be putting forward. Similarly, with including quotations, whether or not you include a question in your introduction might be something to ask your instructor if you're not sure about, if it's something you want to do. But posing a question to your reader can be a way to sort of get them involved, almost like they feel like they're part of the process and they're, able to start thinking about the topics that you're bringing up on their own as well, and that might encourage them to sort of read further to see what answers you can provide on that. So these tips were gained from the University of North Carolina Writing Center. There are plenty of other ways to start off essays too, but these are just some ideas to get you going. Okay, another question, this is probably the one I get the most often about creating introductions, is what sort of background information is needed in between that part that hooks the reader and your main idea, your thesis statement. What sort of things do you need to provide so that your reader can understand your main idea? So this is a sort of thing where it will be very different depending on what you're writing about, what course you're writing for, and so on. But I have come up with some general examples based on common types of essays that I've seen in the past. So for example, if you're writing a paper about one major source, for example, if you're analyzing one specific article that somebody wrote, or if you're writing something about a novel that you've read for an English class, then often the background and context in your introduction will introduce some of maybe the key characters. It might introduce well, definitely will introduce the author and the title of the text, maybe a bit of background of where the source comes from, any of the major themes or ideas that are discussed in the source. Try not to go too broad with that. If you can, try to pinpoint the background about the source that is relevant to your main idea. So for example, if there are specific characters, specific themes, even specific writing techniques that the author uses that you plan to discuss, try to focus in on those fairly quickly, but give a brief overview of those sorts of things, more so than you would just in your main idea, where you'd really be honing in on a couple very specific examples of those sorts of things. If you're writing a thesis statement more about tying concepts together, for example, I see this a lot in the social sciences, in nursing, in other courses where you're studying theories or concepts. Philosophy papers would also fall under this category, where maybe you have to take something that you've learned about in class and apply that to a specific group of people, a specific argument, a certain place, those sorts of things. In that case, I would say for your introduction, you may want to have, potentially some definitions, some general discussion of what the concept or theory is that you're going to be discussing, maybe a brief connection between how that idea, concept, theory relates to whatever it is you're going to be applying it to, whether it's an argument that someone else has made, whether it's a population group. So sort of beginning to draw those connections that your main idea will then be based on. And then the last example I have here is if you're writing an argumentative paper. So for example, if your instructor has asked you to discuss an issue that's commonly spoken about, maybe something where people tend to have opposing opinions on it, and take a side in that debate. If you have a paper like this, the introduction is the best spot to sort of examine all of the different viewpoints that exist about that particular debate, including the ones that you will go on to defend in the paper and the ones that you don't. Because if you're writing an argumentative paper, from the end of your introduction onward, you're really going to want to be focusing just on your message and proving your point to the reader. So the introduction is really the best place to explore any other possible viewpoints that could exist. One more general thing to add here, it's written under the point about tying different concepts together, but I would say that this could be worked into most types of introductions, is including some information that makes it clear why it's important to be discussing the topics or main ideas that you're going to go on to look at in the paper. For example, if you've chosen a particular theory to talk about, maybe one of the reasons you chose it is because it's used very frequently in your discipline, or maybe you see that there are some problems with it, some things that it can't really be applied to that you'd like to dig deeper into. You want there to be a reason for the discussion that you're having, and ideally even in your main idea as well. You want it to be something that matters to a certain extent. So if you can subtly express to the reader what is important about these ideas or these texts or these concepts that you're working with, that's another thing that is good to express somehow in your introduction if you are able to. Okay. And then the final step for your introduction is usually to include your main idea. Like we said, this is often in the form of a thesis statement. There is going to be another video, much like this one, about thesis statements in particular, so I'm not going to go into too much detail on them here. But generally, a thesis statement is 1 or 2 sentences near the end of your essay's introduction. Like we said, for some assignments, it may take you several more sentences to get all of the aspects of your main idea together, but typically try to be aiming for 1 or 2 sentences to sum up that idea if you can. And this thesis statement, it will express the specific core idea of your essay. So this is quite different than the topic of your essay. The topic would just be generally the subject matter it's dealing with, but the thesis statement really has a message. It's what you want to say about whatever that thing is. And in your thesis statement, you want it to be an argument that other people can dispute. So not something where you get into a fight with anyone or something like that, but just, it can't really be a statement of fact. There has to be some element of opinion or something that needs to be proven and backed up by examples for your reader to really believe and trust what you're saying. So that's why, yeah, we can also say maybe not always an argument, but if you're writing a purely factual or informative paper, you still want your thesis statement to be something that needs discussion in some way, or it needs examples to back it up to really show that it's something that readers can either agree with you on or trust you on. Okay. Your thesis statement should also be doing one of two things, depending on the way that your assignment is structured. If you've been given a specific prompt or a specific question that you need to answer, then your thesis statement should be your answer to whatever that question is that the assignment is asking. If you've been given a more open-ended prompt, something that doesn't have a specific question, then you'd want your thesis statement to be a logical conclusion that you can draw from the evidence that you're using. So when you're coming up with your thesis statement and developing your introduction, I would definitely recommend doing some research fairly early on in the process so that you have some idea of what conclusion you can draw that you will be able to support with evidence throughout your paper. And like we said before, ideally you want your thesis statement to be something that matters, whether it's something important to you personally, whether it's something you find interesting, whether it's something you think people should be talking about more, something that's been overlooked maybe in the literature. Try to identify something that will make the writing process feel meaningful to you, and then you can sort of infuse your introduction with that meaning. And that can be another way to draw your reader in too. If they feel like what you're talking about is important, then they will be more invested in seeing what you have to say. So now that we've looked at those several different components, I just want to show an example, a pretty simple example, of how all of these components look when they're put together into an introduction. So I will take the text of this introduction example. It will be included somewhere around the video so that you can read over it more easily yourself. But for now, I'm just going to show it in this color-coded version here to sort of show where the hook of the introduction is, then from there how it moves into the background and context, and from there into the thesis statement. Just to give you an idea of how those elements all look when they're laid out in that order. So as you can see here, the very first sentence acts as the hook of the essay. The middle several sentences provide some more background and context for what the author is going to be discussing, and then the very final sentence is the one that includes the thesis statement, where it says the specific main idea that the author wants to get across in the essay. And there are lots of other examples like this online. Perhaps I shall link a few more of those somewhere around this video so that you can see examples for different disciplines and how they sound.